Good evening. Happy Halloween. I think it's really awesome that the end of this book kind of coincides with this time, since it starts the first week of November. And I wanted to give a little trigger warning. It may get a little intense in this part of the story, and it deals with sensitive issues, a certain kind of ideation, shall we beep, ideation, and a little bit of beep, rehearsal behavior, but it's done in the eyes of innocence. Alright? But that's all the warning you're going to get, because I do not want to spare you the intensity of the story due to the beautiful of the ending. Alright? So, you've been warned in the description a little slightly, and you'll have been warned here. And I know that the kind of audience that I would attract would probably be people who have gone through struggles. And then tomorrow we're going to kick around some ideas that I've been churning around this week, if I can recover them. I've had pretty dramatic fall back into my own depression, so the kind of conversation that I have been planning all week might be changed just a little bit. Anyway, I'm sorry about the ado. Chapter 8. The Great Brain's Reformation. It was the first week in November before Andy Anderson was able to attend school. Mr. Jameson, the carpenter, had built a wooden peg leg for Andy with a pad made from leather where the knee rested. At first, all of us kids were quite awed by the peg leg. We tried it on, we walked on it, but the novelty soon wore off, and we began calling him Peg Leg. Andy couldn't join us in most of the games we played. His father must have realized this, and had ordered an erector set from Sears Roebuck. I guess he thought the erector set would draw kids to the Anderson home where they would play with Andy. He was right. I learned from Howard K. one Saturday that the erector set had arrived. We ran all the way to the Anderson home. Andy came hobbling on his peg leg to the front door after we had rung the bell. Howard and I reminded him that we were his friends. He invited us into the house, and we played with the erector set until noon. I told Tom about it as we sat on the front porch waiting for Mama to call us in for lunch. "Gosh, J.D.," I said, still filled with wonder. "You never saw anything like it in your whole life. You could build windmills and steam shovels, cranes, and all kinds of things that actually work when you turn a crank." "I saw a picture of the set in the Sears Roebuck catalog," Tom said. "It cost $6. If I had a set like that, I could make a fortune." "How?" I asked. "By charging kids a penny an hour to play with it," Tom answered. Then his face became thoughtful. "Well, maybe I can work out a deal with Andy." "No, you can't," I said. "His father bought him the set so the kids would play with Andy. You start charging, some kid will tell Andy's father." "I guess you're right," Tom admitted. "To heck with the erector set. After lunch, we'll go to the Jensen place and get your pup. They've been weaned now for over 3 weeks, and they're just about right to take home." After lunch, Tom told me to take Brownie with us. "Lady won't make a fuss about losing her pups if she thinks they're going with her father," Tom said wisely. Frank and Alan Jensen were waiting in the backyard by Lady's doghouse. Brownie ran around smelling the pups and playing with them. He sat back on his haunches looking proud as all get out. Lady had given birth to 5 male puppies and 3 females. Tom picked up the male pups one by one and carefully examined them. He took his time before handing me one of the male pups. This is the best of the litter," Tom said. I held the puppy so he could lick my face and get to know me. Take your second pick, Alan said to Tom. I looked at Alan. Are you giving TD a pup for rescuing you from Skeleton Cave? I asked. Shucks no, Alan said. You can't pay anybody for saving your life. This is part of the deal we made with Tom before we got lost in the cave. What deal? I asked, and couldn't help feeling I was somehow getting swindled. Well, Tom wouldn't let us mate Lady with Brownie until we promised him the pick of the litter for you and a male pup for him, Alan explained. Well, I should have known. There had to be a catch in it when Tom had so generously offered to help me get the best pup for nothing. Tom made his selection. He cradled the male pup in his arm. Are you sure they've been weaned for at least 3 weeks? He asked Frank. Frank nodded. Just like Mr. Monair said. I knew Mr. Monair was the biggest sheep man in the country. I couldn't understand what business it was of his. I looked at Frank and Alan. Are you going to give Mr. Monair the extra pups? I asked, knowing the owner of a female dog usually kept only 1 or 2 of the pups out of the litter. They both looked at Tom, who answered me. Mr. Monair wants the pups that he's going to buy to be old enough to send out with his sheep herders, he said. Going to buy? I asked in astonishment. In all of my life I had never heard of anybody paying for a pup. These aren't ordinary pups, Tom said. They will make excellent sheepdogs. Mr. Monair promised to pay $2 for each male and $1 for each female. Then he looked at Frank and Alan. How many are you going to sell? He asked. Frank shrugged. We can only sell 2 of the females, he said. Pa promised the neighbors 2 male pups and 1 female. He said we could keep just 1 male pup. Alan picked up 2 of the female puppies as Lady began to whine. I followed him with Brownie tagging along at my heels, going down to the stockyards by the railroad tracks. There were hundreds of sheep in the stock pens. Sheep herders with sheepdogs were busy preparing the sheep being sent to the market from the ones to be turned out for winter grazing. Mr. Monair was standing by the sheep shearing pens. Here are the pups by Brownie and Lady, like I promised last spring, Tom said to Mr. Monair. This one is a male. Frank and Alan have 2 females they want to sell. Mr. Monair carefully examined the 3 pups. Well, they will make fine sheep dogs, he said. Then he called to a sheep herder, and told the man to take the pups. I watched bug-eyed as Mr. Monair took out his purse and handed Tom 2 silver dollars and Frank and Alan a silver dollar apiece. Mr. Monair patted the head of the pup in my arms. "You want to sell your pup, son?" he asked. "I promise we'll take good care of him." "No, sir," I said. We left the stockyards with Tom jingling 2 silver dollars in his pocket, and Frank and Alan flipping their dollars into the air and catching them. I was so full of indignation I thought I'd bust wide open. I wanted to denounce my brother as a swindler and a cheat on the spot. But I made a promise to Mama one time that I would never argue with my brothers in front of the other kids. I waited until we got to Main Street and Frank and Alan turned off to go home. "You cheated me!" I cried. Tom stopped and stared at me as if I'd suddenly turned into a horned toad. "How could you say a thing like that?" he asked in indignation. "You got the pick of the litter, didn't you?" "But you got $2, I accused him. "You could sell your pup for $2 too," Tom said. "I don't want to sell my pup," I cried. "Then what are you griping about?" Tom demanded. "I think I got cheated," I said. Tom put his hand on my shoulder. "Now listen to me, J.D., he said earnestly. "Last spring, when I saw Brownie making up to a female dog for the first time, I put my great brain to work. I took Brownie and Lady to see Mr. Monair, and told them that Brownie was a purebred Alaskan and Lady was a genuine sheepdog. He carefully examined both dogs and agreed with me. And then I drove a hard bargain with Mr. Monair. I got him to agree to pay $2 for any male pup and $1 for any female pup by Lady and Brownie. "So what?" I asked. "I say you still cheated me." "Now let's assume," Tom said, "that I hadn't put my great brain to work last spring. What would have happened? We would have mated Brownie with Lady, right?" "Right," I said. "And Lady would have had her litter of pups, right?" "Right," I agreed. "And as the owner of the male dog, you would have been entitled to the pick of the litter, right?" "Right," I said. "And the pup you now hold in your arms is the pick of the litter, right?" "Right," I said. Then how could you possibly say I cheated you? Tom asked as if I hurt his feelings terribly. I don't know, I said, all confused, but it still doesn't seem right to me. But you just agreed with me that everything I said was right, J.D. And now, how can so many rights be wrong? I know I did, but I couldn't finish the sentence because I couldn't think of anything to put after the but. You know the Jensens are not rich, Tom said. Sure, I admitted. But what has that got to do with us? Or with it? Frank and Alan never had a whole dollar in their whole lives, Tom said. If it hadn't been for me and my great brain, their father would have given the extra pups away. Are you so selfish and jealous, J.D., that you wouldn't want poor Frank and Alan to ever have a dollar of their own? Gosh, no, I said. You wait. I am definitely going to rip into Tom. I'm going to give him a psychoanalysis that'll seem like patty cakes. As much as I love the kid. Woo! Well, you're certainly acting like it, Tom said. I am? I questioned. Well, you certainly are, Tom said. I felt ashamed. I didn't mean to, I said, trying to defend myself. And to top it off, Tom said, looking really hurt now, you accuse me, your own brother, of cheating you. I was only looking out for your interest all the time. I wanted to be sure you got the best male pup of the litter, and you did. To show you my heart's in the right place, J.D., I'm going to treat you to a nickel's worth of candy at the ZCMI store. Such generosity made me feel even more ashamed. I'm sorry I said you cheated me, I apologized. We walked over to the ZCMI store, and not until I was munching on a stick of licorice did my brother speak to me again. I accept the apology you made a while ago on one condition. Eating licorice purchased by and given to me by my brother, I was in no position to argue. But I think I was at least a little entitled to know what the condition was. What condition? I asked. That you don't tell Mama and Papa about the deal I made with Mr. Monair, Tom said. When my great brain rescued Frank and Alan from Skeleton Cave, it made me quite a hero in Mama and Papa's eyes. I wouldn't want them thinking that the deal I made with Mr. Monair had anything to do with it. I would have put my great brain to work to rescue Frank and Alan even if Lady hadn't been with them. I couldn't remember exactly at the moment, but it seemed to me that Tom hadn't put his great brain to work on the rescue until after he told me it would cost him a fortune if Frank and Alan weren't rescued. I couldn't bite the hand that was feeding me licorice at the moment, so I gave my brother the benefit of the doubt, and yet I didn't realize how cruel we kids were to Andy Anderson until the following Saturday. Tom and I were playing marbles with Andy in our backyard, and it was one of the few games Andy could still play. Sammy Leeds, Basil, J.B. Peterson, Danny Forrester, and Howard Kay came into the yard from the alley. We're going to play kick the can, Sammy said. Want to play? Sure, I said, jumping to my feet. Tom picked up his marbles and shoved them into his pocket. He got to his feet. Let's go, he said. We all ran into the alley except Andy. Tom drew a line in the dirt. We stood 20 feet away and tossed rocks at the line. Sammy's rock landed the furthest from the line. He was it. The rest of us ran to hide, as Sammy set up the tin can in the alley. Well, the purpose of the game was to kick the can without letting Sammy tag us. If he did tag us, one of us, before we kicked the can, then whoever he tagged had to be it. Tom ran into the alley, pretending that he was going to kick the can, just to get Sammy to chase him. Basil sneaked behind Sammy and kicked the can. Sammy had to get the can and put it back in place. We had been playing for some time, and Basil was it. Then We had been playing for some time, and Basil was it when I decided to sneak into our woodshed. I could watch through a crack until Basil got far enough away from the can for me to run out of the woodshed and kick it. I entered the woodshed. Andy was sitting on the chopping block with his back toward me. He was crying. Darn old peg leg, he sobbed. Darn old good old... No, peg leg, I wish it was dead. step back out of the woodshed without letting him know I'd seen and heard. The following Saturday afternoon, Tom and I were on the front of our lawn playing at Indian wrestling with Andy watching us. Sammy and the gang came along on their way to the Smith's vacant lot to play 1-0 cat ball. Sammy had his ball and bat with him. Tom and I ran into the house to get our mitts. Just as we came out of the front door with our mitts, I saw Andy going around the corner of our house. I tossed my mitt on the front porch swing and followed him. I saw Andy walk around to the rear of our barn. I crept closer. Andy was sitting with his back against the barn. He had his arms around his knees, and with his head buried on them. His shoulders were shaking. He was crying so hard it looked as if his whole body was trembling. I didn't want him to know I'd been spying on him. I crept around to the front of the barn and made a lot of noise entering it. When I pushed loose the board aside at the rear and stepped out, or then Andy was wiping his eyes with his sleeve. "I thought you went to play ball," he said, as if he resented me being there. "I changed my mind," I said, as I sat down beside him. "'Cause you feel sorry for me," he said with bitterness in his voice. "Well, sure, I feel sorry for you," I said. But is it really so bad having a peg leg?" "What good is a kid with a peg leg?" he said hopelessly. "I can't run and play with the other kids. I can't do my chores. It's like my pa said. I'm plumb useless." "Your father said you were plumb useless?" I asked, unable to believe any father could be so cruel. "He didn't know I heard him," Andy said. "I tried doing my chores for the first time when I got home from school yesterday. I got an armful of kindling from the woodshed. I fell, trying to get up the back porch steps, and spilled it. Then I dropped and spilled a bucket of coal. Then I tried to collect the eggs in the hen house, and I dropped and broke them. Mama told me not to try to do any chores anymore. And when Papa come home, she told him. Papa didn't know I was on the back porch, and I could hear Ma in the kitchen. That's when he said they would have to take care of me the rest of my life because I was plumb useless." "I guess that makes you plumb useless, all right," I said. "Well, what's the use of me going on living when I'm plumb useless?" Andy said. "Not much," I said, thinking how it would be if I couldn't play with the other kids, and if my father thought I was plumb useless. "I'm going to do myself in," Andy said desperately. I couldn't help getting excited. "You mean you're going to yourself?" I cried. "Give me one good reason why not," Andy said. I thought, and I thought, and I thought, but I couldn't think of one good reason. I was about ready to give up when I thought of the erector set. "Well, you're the only kid in town with an erector set," I said, hoping that would cheer him up. "What good is an erector set when I'm plumb useless, like my pa said?" Andy asked. Then he looked at me. "Will you help me, John?" And I couldn't turn a friend down in need. "Sure," I promised. "We've got to figure out a way to do myself in good and proper," Andy said with a serious expression. We discussed several ways for Andy to himself, only to discard them. I had never realized before what a problem it was going to be for a person to figure out a way to himself. I was about to suggest we get Tom and his great brain to figure it out for us when Andy came up with an idea that sounded promising. "Well, when the people want to get rid of kittens that they don't want," he said, "they put them in a sack and throw them into the river." "Hey, that's a good idea," I admitted. "But I'm not strong enough to carry you in a gunny sack down to the river and throw you in." "You don't have to carry me down there," Andy said. "You mean I'll tie you up in the sack when we get there?" I asked. "We'll have to tie the sack good and hard so I can't get out," Andy said, "because I'm a good swimmer, peg leg and all." And by this time, I was quite excited and enthusiastic about the plan. "Well, I'll tie you up in the sack and roll you off the diving board into the deepest part of the swimming hole," I said. Then I looked up at the snow on the mountain peaks. "But the water in the river is going to be mighty cold," I warned him. "Well, who cares how cold is the water when I'm going to drown?" Andy asked. "Let's go." When we went to the barn, I got a big gunny sack that was empty. It was the kind that Oates came in to feed our team of horses and Swin's Mustang, Dusty. It was plenty big enough for drowning. Then I got some twine. We started off for the river. Andy was very happy and cheerful at the prospect of himself in. It made me feel good knowing I was helping to make him happy and cheerful. When we arrived at the swimming hole, Andy took off his peg leg and stripped down to his underwear. "Maybe my folks will have another son someday who can wear my clothes," he said, as his body began shivering from the cold wind blowing off the mountains. "See that they get them. I'm giving my peg leg to you, John." "What will I do with it?" I asked. "I don't know," he said. "I just thought you might like it, sort of to remember me." "That would be nice," I had to admit. I helped Andy get into the sack. I closed the top and tied it with twine, and then rolled him to the riverbank. I located his head in the sack and patted it. We were at the diving board. I told him, "I'm going to roll you up the diving board now. You can sort of help by turning yourself as I push you." I was afraid Andy would fall off the diving board before we reached the end of it, but he didn't. Again, I patted him on the head. "Hey, one more push and you're a goner," I said. "Are you ready, old pal?" "Tell my folks I did it because I'm plumb useless." Andy's voice came out of the gunny sack. "And I sure appreciate you helping me to... You're a real pal, John. I'm ready. Goodbye, old pal," I said, feeling sad as I rolled Andy off the edge of the diving board. I don't understand. Goodbye, old pal. Hey, it's Halloween. This is a horror story after all, isn't it? Hi. The gunny sack with Andy in it hit the water. I was expecting to see a few air bubbles after the big splash as Andy went to his death. Instead, the water began to churn, and to my astonishment, Andy's head popped out of it. He began swimming toward the river bank as the gunny sack floated downriver. I ran to meet him. "Gee whiz, John," he said, with his teeth chattering from the cold water. "Couldn't you tie a knot that would hold? The sack busted right open when I hit the water." I was a little nettled by his attitude. I thought I tied a good knot. "You could have pretended the sack didn't open and let yourself drown," I pointed it out to him. "Well, even a fool knows if you know how to swim, you can't let yourself drown," he said, as if completely disgusted with me. "Well, I'll run back to the barn and get another sack and some baling wire," I said, "and I'll tie you up with the baling wire so you'll never get out." "It's too darn cold," Andy said, as he started to dress with his clothes sticking to his wet body. "Let's figure out a better way." "Well, maybe you'll get pneumonia and die," I said, trying to cheer him up. "I ain't that lucky," he said. We were both pretty disgusted when we returned to the barn. Andy was disgusted because he was still alive, and I was disgusted because I let a pal down. We sat down at the rear of the barn in the sun so Andy's clothes would dry. "I guess we'll have to get Tom to help us," I said. "With his great brain, he could figure out a dozen ways to put you out of your misery." "No, John," Andy said. "Tom might decide to tell my folks instead. It's up to you and me. I know I can trust you." I saw a broken bottle lying in the weeds. "Well, how about..." I suggested. Andy thought about it for a moment. "That's too messy," he finally said. We sat there until Andy's clothes were all dry, trying to think of a way for him to... I was about to give up when I heard Swin's Mustang, Dusty, moving around in his stall outside the barn. It reminded me of how they hang outlaws. "I've got it!" I cried with astonishment. "How about... that isn't messy." Andy's face broke into a grin. "Well, that's a peach of an idea," he said. "We'll just like they do outlaws," I said. "Well, I'm no outlaw," Andy protested. "You can pretend you're one, can't you?" I asked. Why must I pretend to be an outlaw? Andy wanted to know. Look, Andy, I said, a little exasperated with him. I promised Swin when he went to Salt Lake to school that I would take good care of Dusty. You don't think I'd let Dusty anybody who wasn't an outlaw, do you? It wouldn't be fair to Dusty. He's got to think he's a real sure outlaw. All right, Andy agreed. I'll pretend I'm an outlaw for Dusty's sake. This stuff is too sensitive for me. Just remember children's innocence. We'll have to talk about morality tomorrow. I went into the barn and got Swin's lariat and climbed up the rope ladder to Tom's loft. I tossed one end of the lariat over a rafter and let the rope slide down until Andy got a hold of it. I climbed down the rope ladder. I tied at the end of the lariat. I was still a little angry about Andy bawling me out for the knot I tied on the gunny sack. Are you satisfied it's a good and strong, and it won't come loose? I asked. Andy inspected it very carefully. Satisfied, he said. I put a halter on Dusty and led the Mustang out. Where you at, babe? I'm not pausing. I've lost my place, actually. Anyway, he helped Andy onto Dusty's back. Wow, I can't handle this stuff at all. Do. They got some things done in preparation. I jumped down from the bale of hay and got the other end of the lariat. I tied it securely to a small post. I stood back and looked at the lariat from the stall post to the rafter and down to where it went. It was all right, all tight. Everything was ready. Dusty, I said to the Mustang, that's Andy Anderson on your back, and that's no good outlaw peg-leg Andy you're about to deal with. Andy looked at me as if he understood, or Dusty looked at me as if he understood. I walked around behind him. Are you ready, you no good outlaw? I asked Andy. Ready, Andy replied. And before I go, John, I wanted to let you know how much I appreciate you helping me with this. You are a real pal. I took off my cap and raised my arm, and I hit Dusty over the rump with my cap. I expected the Mustang to jump and leave, but he didn't move. I hit him again, and I yelled an Indian war cry, and he turned his head and looked at me with his ears flattened back, which meant he was angry. I hit him again with my cap, and I let a real blood-curdling Indian war cry, and Dusty slowly turned around so Andy wouldn't fall off. He grabbed my cap out of my hand with his teeth. He dropped the cap with his forelegs and put a hoof on it. Then he twisted his head, and he rubbed his nose against Andy's good leg. He knows you, because Swin lets you ride him a few times, I said. He knows you aren't an outlaw. See if you could lead him, Andy said. I ain't got all day. I took a hold of the halter and pulled on it. I begged Dusty to move. I coaxed him. I threatened him. All Dusty did was flatten his ears back to let me know he was plenty angry at me. Well, try kicking him, I said to Andy. Andy kicked Dusty in the flanks. And any other time Dusty would have bucked like crazy, but he didn't move an inch. His ears got flatter and flatter. And as Andy kicked him in the flanks, I pulled on the halter. What the devil's going on here? I heard Tom's voice behind me. Trying to hang an outlaw, I said over my shoulder, but Dusty won't help me. Stop it, you fool! Tom shouted. You could kill Andy. What's the idea? I said, as I continued to pull on the halter, and Andy kept kicking on Dusty's flanks. Andy's plumb useless with his leg, and he wants to do himself in, and I'm his pal, and I'm helping him. Tom grabbed the halter out of my hand. Steady, boy, he said to Dusty as he patted the Mustang on the nose. Now, J.D., he said to me as he kept patting Dusty on the nose, untie the lariat from the stall post. I knew Dusty wasn't going to cooperate, so I untied the lariat. Tom let go of the halter. He took out his jackknife and stepped up to the bale of hay. He cut the twine from Andy's wrists, and he loosened the noose, and he took it off of his head. Then he helped Andy down from the Mustang. If he was expecting any thanks, he sure got a surprise. "Why'd you have to butt in?" Andy said as tears came to his eyes. Tom looked surprised, all right. "You mean you actually wanted to? And you weren't just playing a game?" he asked, looking astonished. "Well, what good is a kid with a peg leg?" Andy sobbed as he sat down on the bale of hay and put his face in his hands. "I can't play with the other kids. I can't do my chores. I'm plumb useless. Like Pa said, better off dead." "Nobody's plumb useless," Tom said. "A lot you know," Andy cried. "Even with your great brain, you can't grow me another leg." "Of course I can't," Tom admitted. "But my great brain can prove to the world that you aren't plumb useless." For the first time since Andy lost his leg, I saw hope come into his eyes as he looked at Tom. "If you could prove I'm not plumb useless to my pa, I'll give you anything I've got," he promised. A cunning look spread over Tom's face. "Even your erector set?" he asked. Andy hesitated. "Well, I don't know if Pa would let me," he said. "What would your pa do with the erector set if you did that thing?" Tom asked. "I mean, if you want to do that thing, or go on being plumb useless over an erector set, that's your business." Tom started for the front door. "Wait, Tom!" Andy shouted. "It's a deal." Tom turned around and walked over to the bale of hay. He held out his hand. "Let's shake on it," he said. They shook hands to seal the bargain. "I'll put my great brain to work on this right away," Tom promised Andy. "Meet me here after school, starting Monday." After Andy left the barn to go home, Tom began to rub his hands together gleefully. "I'll make a fortune with that erector set, charging kids a penny an hour to play with it," he said. That evening after supper, Tom sat staring into the burning log in the fireplace in our parlor for a long time, before he got up and walked over to Papa. "Papa," he said, "is it true that when a person loses an arm or a leg, they get twice the strength in the other arm or leg?" Papa laid aside a book he was reading. "Well, perhaps not twice the strength, TD," he said, "but I've heard it said, on good authority, that a person does have more strength in the remaining limb. One theory is that it is a biological thing, that when the human body loses a limb, an organic change takes place that transfers more strength to the remaining limb. Another theory, and a much more logical one, is that the person loses an arm or leg will naturally use the remaining limb a great deal more, and this would of course strengthen that limb. Well, I did know a one-armed miner in Silverlode who had twice the strength of a normal man in his one arm. I saw him perform feats of strength with that one arm that were amazing." "Thank you, Papa," Tom said, smiling. Tom and I were waiting in our barn Monday after school when Andy arrived. Tom put his hands on Andy's shoulders. "Do you promise to put yourself in complete charge of my great brain and do everything I tell you to do?" he asked. "I promise," Andy said. "Good," Tom said. "The first thing you've got to do is stop feeling sorry for yourself." "I'll bet you'd feel sorry for yourself if you had a peg leg," Andy said. "No, I wouldn't," Tom said to my surprise, "because I'd show every kid in town, and my mother and my father, that a peg leg didn't make any difference. And we'll start by making you the best Indian squaw wrestler in town." "Fat chance," Andy said. "Basil's the champion." "You listen to me, Andy Anderson," Tom said, getting angry. "When a person loses one leg, he gets twice the strength in the remaining leg. That means you've got double the strength in your right leg of any kid your age and size in town. Hey, my papa's the smartest man in town, and he said this was true. Are you calling my papa a liar?" "Gosh, no," Andy said quickly. "My pa always said your pa was the smartest man in town." "Well, then you must believe you've got twice the strength in your right leg than you would have if you had two legs," Tom said. "And that means you should be able to beat Indy kid at Indian squaw wrestling who are bigger and older than you. Tom got a horse blanket off from Dusty's stall. Excuse me. He spread it out on the floor of the barn. He lay down on his back. He motioned for Andy to lay down beside him with their feet at each other's head. They locked their right arms at the elbow. Tom began to count. They raised their right legs at the count of 1 and let them down. At the count of 2, they again raised their right legs and let them down. At the count of 3, they locked their right legs at the knees. The winner in Indian squaw wrestling was the one who could force the opponent's leg down and kill the opponent over backwards in a somersault. I watched breathlessly as they both began to grunt. Tom slowly forced Andy's leg down and Andy went over backward. Tom sat up on the horse blanket. He looked sternly at Andy. "Papa says you got twice the strength in your right leg of any kid in town your age," he said. It wasn't what Papa said at all, but I knew it was part of the Great Brain's plan, so I kept quiet. "I'm older and bigger than you," Tom continued, "but according to my father, you should be able to beat me at Indian squaw wrestling. Either you aren't trying, or you don't believe my father." "I tried. Honest I did," Andy protested. "Then you didn't try hard enough," Tom said. "You've got to keep telling yourself that your right leg is twice as strong as any boy in town your age. Now try again." They took their positions lying on their backs. Again Tom counted. At the count of 3, they locked legs. They began to grunt and strain. I couldn't believe my eyes as I watched Andy slowly force Tom's leg down and cow my brother over in a somersault. "You did it!" Tom shouted as he pounded Andy on the back. "You mean I won fair and square?" Andy asked as if he couldn't believe it. "Fair and square," Tom said, "but you need a lot of practice. We'll put in 1 hour practice every day until you're the best Indian squaw wrestler in town." Andy was whistling for the first time since he lost his leg, and he left our barn an hour later. I asked Tom if Andy really won most of those matches that afternoon. "No, JD, Tom said, "but he thinks he did, and that's what counts. I got to build up his confidence." At the end of 2 weeks' daily practice, Tom pronounced Andy ready to meet all comers at Indian squaw wrestling. "The next thing is to prove you can play any game as good as a kid with 2 legs," Tom announced in the barn after school that day. "We'll start with duck on a rock." Excuse me. Ooh. It's a long chapter. I helped Tom carry 2 flat slabs of rock into the barn and placed them 10 paces apart. We put a round rock about the size of a baseball on each slab. We laid 6 round rocks about the size of a baseball near one of the slabs. Tom picked one up. The idea of the game was to knock the rock representing the duck off of the slab. Tom threw and hit that duck, knocking it off. I ran to put it back. Andy then made an underarm pitch, but missed the slab by 3 feet. "It's no good," he said, discouraged. "I can't balance myself on this peg leg." "Take it off," Tom said. I watched Tom strap the peg leg to his left knee. Tom took a few steps around on the peg leg. Then he tried pitching rocks at the duck on the rock, with his left leg in the front of him. Then he tried pitching with his right leg in front of him. "You get off balance," Tom said to Andy, "when you put the peg leg in front and bring your weight down on it when you pitch." "But that's the way I pitch," Andy protested. "I can't pitch with my right leg in front." "Of course you can. Now watch me." Tom took a pitch. He missed the duck on a rock, but it did hit the slab. He took off the peg leg and handed it to Andy. "Now we'll play. First one to knock the duck off the rock 10 times is the winner." The first game, Tom got 10 ducks before Andy knocked off even one. The second game, Andy improved. He got 2 ducks before Tom knocked off 10. They kept at it until it was time for Andy to go home. During the last game, Andy knocked off 5 ducks before Tom got 10. "Practice makes perfect," Tom said as we came out of the barn, "and we'll keep at it until you can hold your own with any kid in town." The next afternoon, when Andy met us in the barn, his face was thoughtful. "I'd wish you'd do something about my chores," he said to Tom. "Well, my pa's going to think I'm useless as long as he has to do my chores for me." "I guess that is more important than learning how to play games with your peg leg," Tom said. "We'll spend half of our time each day teaching you how to do your chores, and the other half teaching you how to play games. Now, why can't you do your chores?" "Well, gee," Andy said, "you know, I got this peg leg." "Answer the question," Tom said. "Well, for one thing, I can't get up and down the back porch steps without holding onto the railing with one hand. So I can't carry an armful of kindling, which you have to hold with both hands. And the buckets full of coal are so heavy I have to lift them up the steps with both hands. And I wobble so much that I can't carry a pail of milk without—" "That's enough," Tom interrupted him. "Let's go to our back porch." We walked to the steps of our back porch. "Show me how you go up and down the steps," Tom ordered Andy. Andy took hold of the railing and walked up and down the steps. "All right, take off the peg leg and let me try," Tom said. "You've got to go, or you try to go up and down as if you got two good legs. When you put the peg leg up first, you got to pull yourself up by holding onto the railing." Tom strapped onto the peg leg. "Now watch me," he said. He put his right foot on the step, using his right leg, lifted his body up, bringing the peg leg up beside his right leg. "There's nothing to it," he said. "Let your good leg do all the work." Andy watched bug-eyed as Tom went up the rest of the stairs without holding on to the railing. "Now I'll come down," he said. He tried putting his right foot down first and lost his balance. He tried to grab the railing to keep from falling. "It worked going up," Tom said. Again he tried putting his right foot down first. Again he lost his balance. He sat down on the steps. "If it works going up, why won't it work going down?" he asked as if talking to himself. "You fellas be quiet. I've got to put my great brain to work." Andy and I remained quiet. I knew Tom's great brain was working like 60 as I watched wrinkles come into his forehead. Suddenly the wrinkles disappeared. Tom was smiling as he stood up. "I used my good leg to lift my body going up," he said. "I made the mistake of trying to use the peg leg to lift my body going down. Now watch this." Tom bounced himself on his right leg, holding his weight as he put the peg leg down on a step. Then he stood on the peg leg for just a second while he quickly brought his right foot down a step. He came like that all the way down the steps without losing his balance. He took off the leg and handed it to Andy. "You saw me go up using my right leg to lift my body. You saw me go down using my right leg to lift my body. Now you try it." Andy strapped on the leg. He had no trouble going up, but he lost his balance coming down. "It's harder to come down," Tom said, "but don't get discouraged. All it takes is practice." Tom made Andy practice going up and down the steps for an hour. The next afternoon after school, Tom and I were waiting for Andy on the steps of our back porch. Again, Tom made Andy go up the stairs for an hour. Up and down. Andy got so he could practically run up and down the steps without holding onto the railing. The next afternoon, Tom's face was thoughtful as we waited for Andy. "You know, JD," he said to me, "I think it's time for Andy to learn how to carry things up and down the steps, and to make sure he can do his chores to please his father. I think I'll start letting him do our chores." Dee. Not a swindle. When Andy arrived, my brother led him to the woodshed. "We were going to start practicing doing real chores today," Tom said. "We'll begin by letting you fill all the wood boxes in our house with kindling wood." Andy looked so happy. I didn't even have the heart to tell him that he was being taken. With a big happy grin on his face, he carried a big armful of kindling from our woodshed up the steps into the kitchen and dumped it into the wood box by the kitchen range. "What is this all about?" Mama asked. "Teaching Andy how to do his chores," Tom said proudly. And Bertha just shook her head. "Oh, that boy," she said. As I watched Andy fill the wood boxes for the fireplace, the potbelly stove in the dining room, and the stove in the bathroom. "And now for the coal buckets," Tom said, as we came out of the kitchen carrying empty coal buckets. Then I guess my brother's conscience bothered him a bit. "No hurry, Andy," he said. "Take a rest if you want." Andy still had that happy grin on his face. "I don't need a rest," he said. "Let's go." After Andy had filled all the coal buckets in our house, I thought that was enough for today. But not Tom. "I'd let you do the milking," Tom said, "but I'm afraid you might spill it carrying it. So we'll spend the rest of the day practicing." Tom got a milk pail and filled it full of water at the hydrant. "Now I want you to practice carrying this to the barn and back until it's time for you to go home." Andy spilt half the water out of the bucket the first trip as Tom and I watched. "Well, no wonder your father won't let you bring in the milk," Tom said. "Give me that bucket." My brother filled the pail with water. He then strapped on the peg leg, and he picked up the water and started to walk. He spilled it all over. "Now watch, JD," he said, "and tell me if the water spills when I'm on my right leg or the peg leg." I watched as Tom started to walk. The water spilled when he tried to step on the peg leg. So I told him. "It's because I'm trying to take a natural step," he said. "Now I'm going to take a little short step with the peg leg to help me keep an even balance." He looked funny, taking a little short step with the peg leg and a big step with the right leg, but he didn't spill a drop. He removed the peg leg and made Andy put it on while he filled the pail to the brim with water. "Now do like you saw me do," he said to Andy. "A short little step with the peg leg and a natural step with the good leg." Tom made Andy practice until it was time for Andy to go home. "Can I start doing my chores at home now?" Andy asked as if excited. "No," Tom said. "You need at least another week of practice. We don't want to take any chances that your father won't be completely satisfied." He made Tom do all of our chores for a whole week before he announced Andy could do his own chores starting the following day. It was a proud day for Andy when he reported that he had done all his chores he used to do at home before he lost his leg. "I brought in the kindling and the coal," he said when he met us at school. "I slopped the pigs without spilling any of the slop from the buckets. I carried the milk in without spilling a drop. I fed the chickens and collected the eggs. I went to the store for Ma, and I carried everything home without dropping anything." Paul says he's proud of me. I guess he doesn't think I'm plumb useless anymore. "Ah, you're still useless as a kid," Tom said. "Hey, what good is a kid who can't run? And if you can't run, you can't play a lot of games. Meet me in our corral after school, and I'll start teaching you to run." "I can't stay late anymore," Andy said. "I've got my chores to do now." "Okay, we'll spend only half hour a day on school days," Tom said. Andy walked home from school with Tom and me. I knew my brother had a great brain, but trying to teach a kid with a peg leg to run was beyond my imagination. I was curious as all get out when we entered the corral. Tom ordered Andy to run around the corral. Andy tried, but he kept falling down. Then Tom strapped on the peg leg. Well, he had no better luck than Andy and kept falling down. "There must be some way of doing it," he said, undaunted. "Tomorrow is Saturday. Meet me here tomorrow afternoon, and I'll put my great brain to work on it and figure it out how to make you run." The next morning, Tom and I did all our chores, and then Mama kept finding other things for us to do. We didn't get a chance to even sit down and rest until just before lunch. We were sitting on the swing on our back porch. We were watching Irene Olson and Christy Mackey playing hopscotch across the street. Tom suddenly snapped his fingers. "That's it!" he shouted. "What?" I asked. "My great brain has figured out a way to make Andy run," he said, grinning. "How?" I asked, wondering how a kid with a peg leg could ever learn to run. "You'll see this afternoon," he said mysteriously. We ate lunch, and then we went to meet Andy in our corral. He arrived a few minutes later. Give me that peg leg, Tom said. He strapped on the leg. Now watch this, he shouted. I burst out laughing as Tom took a hop, a skip, and a jump on his right leg and then a step on the peg leg. It was like watching a man run on 3 legs and looked very comical. He fell down a few times, but he kept on trying until he had run all the way across the corral and back without even stumbling. Now you try it, Tom said to Andy as he unstrapped the leg. An hour later, and Andy was ready to give up. He kept falling down when he tried to run. It's no good, he said, and besides, my knee hurts. How do you think my knee feels? Tom demanded as he rolled up his pant leg and showed us a knee that was turning black and blue. My great brain has figured out how to make you run, and you're going to learn how to run. Now try it again. A week later, Andy was singing a different tune. Tom had made him practice running every day. Today, Tom said as we entered the corral, you are going to race J.D. across the corral and back, and you are going to beat him. I'll beat him, Andy said confidently. Andy and I got on our marks and got set. Tom gave the signal. I beat Andy across the corral, but I had to slow down to turn around. Andy just spun around on his peg leg without slowing down and beat me back to the starting line. You can now run well enough to play any game, Tom announced. I can't play ball, Andy said. Why not? Because I can't bat with a peg leg, Tom explained. Well, fix that. And fix it he did. Within a week, Andy had batted better with peg leg than Andy could ever bat with his 2 good legs. Tom discovered that Andy shut his eyes when he took a swing at the ball. As soon as he trained Andy to keep his eyes on the ball, Andy began whacking Tom's pitches all over the corral. On a Friday, Tom held a whispered conference with Basil during the morning recess. When school let out, Tom and I walked part way home with Andy. Tomorrow is the big day, Tom announced. Meet me in my backyard in the morning, and I'll prove you aren't useless as a kid anymore. The 3 of us were in our backyard the next morning when Basil arrived with Sammy Leeds and Danny Forrester, Jimmy Peterson, and Peter Kyle. Sammy was the first one to speak. Basil tells us he's retiring as champion Indian squaw wrestler. I guess that makes you champ, Tom. I don't know about that, Tom said. You almost beat me a few times. Almost did it that, Tom said, nodding. With Basil retiring, Tom said, I think it's only fair to hold an elimination contest to find out who the new champion's going to be. Tom led the way around to our front lawn, which was turning brown from the approach of winter. As runner-up to the champ, Tom said, it'll be up to me to defeat all challengers, and if I'm to be the champion, who wants to try first? I'll try, Jimmy Peterson said. I know I can't beat you, but I'll try. Tom had no trouble beating Jamie, Danny, Pete, and me. Then it was Sammy's turn. I couldn't believe my eyes as I watched Sammy win the first match. Tom came back and won the second match. The rubber match looked as if it was going to be a tie. At the count of 3, they locked knees. They grunted and puffed, with their right legs remaining upward for a long time. And then slowly and surely Sammy began pressing Tom's leg down. I watched with astonishment as Sammy flipped my brother over backwards and won the rubber match. Sammy jumped to his feet, grinning. Guess that makes me the champ, he said. Aye, Tom got up, looking very downhearted because he lost. There's one more challenger, he said. Andy. It wouldn't be fair to wrestle a cripple, Sammy said. You can't be champion unless you take on all challengers, Tom said. I'll put him down without even trying, he boasted. Sammy and Andy lay down on the lawn and took their positions. Tom counted 1, 2, 3, and they locked legs at the knees. And there was a look of complete bewilderment on Sammy's face as Andy flipped the bigger boy over in a backward somersault. I wasn't set, Sammy complained to Tom. All right, Tom said. The first one doesn't count. Now for the championship match. Best 2 out of 3. Are you ready this time, Sammy? All set, Sammy replied. Andy won 2 straight matches and became the new champion. We all crowded around Andy to congratulate him and pat him on the back, except Sammy. Poor old Sammy just sat on the lawn with a look on his face as if he still couldn't believe Andy had beaten him. Tom suggested we go to our backyard and play duck on a rock. Only 4 could play at a time. Tom chose Andy for his partner. Sammy chose Danny Forrester as his partner for the first game. Tom and Andy beat Sammy and Danny. And then they beat Basil and Jamie and finally had no trouble beating Pete, Kyle, and me. Well, let's change partners this time, Sammy suggested. I'll take Andy for my partner. I don't know if my brother tried his best or not, but Andy and Sammy knocked off 10 ducks to 8 ducks for Tom and Danny and won the game. Then Sammy and Andy beat Basil and Jamie and then clobbered me and Pete. I've had enough of that game, Tom said. Let's play kick the can. Why not play something Andy can play? Sammy said. Hey, what makes you think he can't play kick the can? Tom asked. He can't run on his peg leg, Sammy said. We always let TD play, Tom said, and if Andy can beat him in running, that means he can play. Sure, Sammy agreed, but how can Andy run on a peg leg? Tom pointed. Well, they'll race to the end of the alley and back to the woodshed. We all went into the alley where Andy and I got on our marks. 1 for the money, Tom shouted. 2 for the show. 3 to get on your marks. And off you go. I ran as fast as I could, but Tommy beat me back to the woodshed by 10 feet. Gosh, peg leg, Sammy said, patting Andy on the shoulder. You were just great. I would have never believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. He began laughing. You look funny as the devil, but how you can run. The other kids all congratulated Andy. Then we played kick the can until it was time for lunch. I had to run an errand for Mama after lunch. I ran all the way to the Smith's vacant lot after the errand where I knew the kids were meeting to play baseball. Tom and Sammy had just finished hands over fists on Sammy's bat. Tom had won and got first choice in choosing up the 2 teams to play. Sammy didn't even look surprised when Tom chose Andy first. I guess after what happened that morning, Sammy wouldn't have been surprised if Andy had run and jumped over our barn. We knew we would have time to play only 5 innings before we had to go home and do our chores. I was playing third base on Tom's team. My brother was pitching and Andy was catching. Tom held our opponents scoreless for 4 innings, but in the top of the 5th, they got 2 runs before we made a 3rd out. Tom was leadoff man our last time at bat. He hit the 2nd pitch for a single. Basil then made a sacrifice bunt that put Tom on second base. Then Sammy, who was pitching, got wild and gave Pete Kyle a base on balls? Sammy settled down and struck out Seth Smith. And then it was Andy's turn at bat, and our only hope of winning the game. He took 2 strikes and 2 balls, and then hit the next pitch for a home run. We won the game 3-2. It had taken Tom and his great brain 4 weeks to prove Andy wasn't useless and could hold his own in any game we kids played. I'd forgotten about the erector set until after supper that evening. Andy came to our front door, carrying the set under his arm. He asked Tom to come out on the front porch. I followed. Here's the erector set like I promised, Andy said. I told my pa all you did for me. I told him how you showed me that I could still do my chores with my peg leg. I told him how you helped me so that I could play games with the kids on my peg leg. I told him how you made me feel I was no longer useless. I told him how I would have killed myself if it hadn't been for you. I told him how you'd make me want to go on living. I told him I'd promised you the erector set if you could prove to him and to me that I wasn't useless anymore. Pa said it was all right to give it to you. It was at that moment in my brother's life when he was suddenly attacked by a strange disease which completely paralyzed his brain, and he didn't know what he was doing or saying, or at least that's what I thought, when Tom didn't snatch the erector set out of Andy's hands. "It is true," Tom said modestly. "My brain saved you from suicide's grave. It is also true I proved to you and your pa that you weren't useless. And it is true we made a deal, and I have more than lived up to my end of that bargain. But it just doesn't seem right somehow for me to take the erector set." Andy's eyes got wide. "You don't want it?" he asked, hugging it to his chest. "Of course I want it," Tom answered. "But it just doesn't seem right getting paid for helping somebody not to be useless anymore." "You keep the set, Andy. I'll come over and play with it sometimes." "It's a dream," I told myself, as I watched Andy press his lips together as tears bubbled up in his eyes. "You could play with the set any time," he said, "and my pa said thank you for him, and my ma said God bless you and that she would play for you. Ain't no way for me to say what I feel inside for you making me so I'm not useless anymore. I guess I'll have to thank you in my prayers and ask God to bless you too." Andy walked to our front gate. I could see tears streaming down his cheeks as he turned to wave at us. I knew they were tears of happiness and gratitude as I watched him go whistling down Main Street with the erector set under his arm. And then my thoughts turned to my poor brother. "I'll go get Mama to call Dr. Leroy right away," I said, starting for the front door, positive my poor brother was so sick he didn't know what he was doing. Tom grabbed my arm and stopped me. "I'm not sick, J.D., he said, smiling at me. "As a matter of fact, I feel extra good inside, sort of clean and warm and Christmassy." I stood there bug-eyed as I watched Tom remove the Indian beaded belt Uncle Mark had given me for my birthday and hold it out toward me. "Here's your belt back, G.D., he said. "It's a little worn by now, but still the only genuine Indian beaded belt in town." There wasn't anything my brother could have done to convince me more that he expected to die at any minute from this strange There wasn't anything my brother could have done to convince me more that he was expected to die any moment of this strange malady that had seized him. "I am not going to take advantage of you when I know you are so sick and you don't know what you're doing or saying," I said with my heart breaking with pity for my poor brother. "Please, J.D., he said as he pleaded with me for the first time in his life, "if you love me as a brother, you will take back the belt. I'm not sick. I give you my word. It's just that something has come over me and made me feel really good inside." And so it came to pass. Just a week before Christmas of that year, a miracle took place in Aidenville, Utah. The Christmas spirit arrived at our house early, and, with the help of a little boy with a peg leg, made a true Christian out of my brother. Things got mighty dull after the great brain decided to give up his crooked ways and walk the straight and narrow. So dull, Papa didn't even bother to come upstairs and see if Tom was in bed the night the schoolhouse burnt down. So dull, there's no more to tell. The end. Wow, that is long.